All right, so this week we're starting with the triple constraint, and we're going to have to go through this quickly. What I want you to do is, again, go over the material themselves, the projects, the presentations afterwards. And there's a lot of words on these because we're covering a lot of ground, and so I want you to spend some time with that. But I'll give you a quick run through here of some of the key elements of this one. 4 main areas for planning when we're talking about a project, and we'll take 3 of these and talk about them in terms of the triple constraint: time, cost, scope, and risk. Risk is really a philosophy that we'll talk about a lot when we get into I think week 4, as a philosophy of how we shape everything on a technology project. But time, cost, and scope really constitute the triple constraint. Time is the estimated activity, how long it's going to take. Cost is with labor and such, what the resources are going to be required to do it. And scope is basically the size of the project, right? If you manage all 3 of those things, you can sort of manage the project as you go forward. So what we'll talk about in this particular presentation, we'll go over scope, time, and cost this week, but this particular one's going to be focusing on scope. So if you look at our knowledge areas there, scope is one of them, and how you manage scope is key to being successful in project management for technology. So what is scope management? It refers to all the work involved with creating the product. It has to do with basically what constitutes the deliverable, what is going to be produced as part of the project: hardware, software, documents, meeting minutes, anything that's delivered would be part of the scope, what you're actually going to pay and provide resources to be able to accomplish. So scope management is all the processes involved with managing that. So you might think that you start out with something and that's just what you execute to, but in a technology project, we tend to learn as we go, and we also tend to encounter problems as we go, and both those have to be dealt with in terms of the overall scope as it changes throughout. So you have a proposal, you generate your scope. The project proposal basically is going to have some information that we talked about last week: business case, some financial analysis, market factors, and it's going to have a high-level scope that says these are the areas we'll be operating in, these are the technology we'll be implementing, here's what's going to be addressed, some assumptions and exclusions, high-level resources, success criteria. All those will be translated basically into your scope documentation when you actually kick off the project. So the scope planning processes, their scope definition, is creating what we call the work breakdown structure, we'll get into in a little bit. Scope verification is a process that we'll be executing as a project, formalizing the acceptance of the scope, and then managing the scope as you go forward. It's easy to say this is the scope, this is what we're going to accomplish, and hope that we can last to that. But what reality is, scope is going to be something that changes along with cost, along with time, everything else. We have to have a process for managing what we realize we need to add into this, and also what we might realize that we need to take out of the scope in order to keep it going forward to meet the main success criteria for the project. That's your scope management plan, all right? It's going to document the description, how you prepare the scope document, how you're going to have a scope work breakdown structure, and how you're going to manage the changes going forward. When you're defining scope, 2 of the simple documents that start out the project are the project charter and the scope statement. Okay, charter basically we are allowed, the company has agreed to, we're going to do this project, and here's the basic boundaries of it. The scope statement itself is going to be sort of a more detailed sort of list of here's the project in specifics. Here's as we talk about what the executives agree to as the technologists, here's what we're going to go actually execute to. And what you're really targeting here is success and acceptance. What are the success criteria that really define this project? So there's a lot of things that you want to have done, but what are the ones that at the end of the day, if it does this, the sponsor is going to say, yes, it was successful. Those are the things that are really sort of the key elements, the success criteria. What are the things that need to be present when you actually start using it? And what's going to define success or failure? Acceptance criteria is when you break those down into if someone else other than us looks at this stuff and they say this is what it has to do, this is what it has to look like before we will say yes, we're ready to go. The WBS that we'll be referring to throughout the project, it's basically taking all those different elements of the scope and breaking them down into pieces, organizing them. Because what we can do once we organize all the pieces that have to get done, we can start assigning those as work packages. Then once you can assign those as work packages, you can start to schedule them out, integrate them, and start to see what it's going to cost and how that all is going to fall together. Here we have a sample of that sort of put in an outline. We'll break this out into, for this particular sample WBS, we've got website design, website development, we've got rollout and support. Each one of those is going to have some other sub things that need to get done, steps that need to be taken throughout the course of the project there. So in a WBS, you don't specify necessarily the order. They're just necessarily things that need to get done. You don't talk about costing. Don't talk about who does them. You're just objectively looking at what needs to be accomplished in order to accomplish this project. You can also organize it by phase. So here you got on the left, you've got sort of a visual description of how we're doing this project, this particular sample internet project. So kind of think through that, and then you think about any project you take on. How do you break it into the steps? That's what we're doing here with the WBS. You eventually put it into a Gantt chart like we see here, and we'll be creating these with Microsoft Project. And as you enter each of these items, it'll assign a WBS number on the left. And that number then gives you a task. Then you can start assigning scope. You can start assigning cost and resources too. You can organize those then by project management process groups so that each one of your processes, as you're executing those have steps and scopes identified with them as well. A lot of different ways you can do this. I'll let you kind of read through this stuff and see this, but analogy approach means, look, you can start with something you've done before and kind of make it look like that, right? Start with another WBS. You can do top down, which basically says, I know what the big things are they need to do. Now let's just break those down into smaller tasks. Or you can do bottom up, where you start with sort of the developer saying, how do we get to where we need to go? And everyone just starts to think about all the tasks they got to do and you sort of roll them up. Mind mapping approach is a technique that also uses some creative ways to get through some projects that may not be intuitive what the actual scope is. So for new technology kinds of things, what you want to do a lot of times is this bottom up approach. If you've done something repeatedly, you probably want to start with WBS, but getting some integration of those different areas is sometimes useful as well. So you get a really good feel for what is involved and what needs to be done. This top one is a mind mapping, and what you're saying here is I have an upgrade. Here's all the things as you branch off of those that I know need to get done as part of that. And for each one of those, what are the pieces that need to get done for each one of those? You need to draw this on a board and get yourself a good start at the project. Details, your team members should be involved in developing WBS. It ensures consistency, that we're doing all the same things across the project the same way. It also gets some buy-in. If everyone agrees that this is the scope, the team will generally buy in and make sure that we actually get done what we said we were going to get done. You have to make sure that the WBS is of themselves so they don't get confused later on. Some other details here. Unit of work should really only appear one. So moving on then, best practices for avoiding scope problems. Here's some things you want to keep in mind. Number one, keep the scope realistic. Don't make them so large they can't be completed. And always break down your large projects into a series of smaller ones that you can manage. Involve users in your scope management so that you can assign key users to the project team and give them some ownership of what they're going to have to verify at the end. Again, like we talked about in the first week, use off the shelf. Don't take on a bunch of risk if you don't need to. We always like using the latest stuff, but again, your project scope has to be about what you're trying to accomplish, not about incorporating all the coolest stuff that we have going forward. Continue to follow your good management projects and have users on the project team in important roles, again, so that you know if you're deviating from those acceptance criteria and you can identify that early on. Don't promise to deliver what you can't. What you do want to do is reduce incomplete and changing requirements. So to manage scope and to make sure you don't change as much as possible, follow a good requirements management process. Let me go into talk some of these things. But remember that managing scope is an important part of moving the project and being successful with our project. Review changes from a system perspective. Any changes that come along, we need to use enough discipline within our process to understand what the changes are going to impact, to decide whether we want to take those on, and to be able to vary, what are the actual important things we need to take to mind in terms of cost and schedule to make sure that we don't take on scope changes that we can't afford. So there's an integrated change control aspect of this that we're going to use for scope. We'll use it for software. We'll use it for everything else. The main objectives are to influence the factors that create changes and make sure those changes are beneficial, determine that changes actually occurred, and then manage those actual changes as they occur. Baseline has to be approved by project management continually, so it has to be only the approved changes going forward. Configuration management is going to be the method by which we do that. So you have a configuration for your scope plan. You have a configuration for the project. Any changes to that have to be approved through the configuration management process. Okay, so changes done through scope, through the software and execution, through cost, or through schedule. All those things have to be managed and controlled, as well as the physical design. Here's some change control definitions that we'll be encountering as we go forward. So the change control systems, the CCS, that's the actual system that you're going to be using to track these things. Change control board is going to be the set of people that actually make those decisions about what actually goes in and what doesn't go in terms of change. Then the process is how the board and the software sort of manage all that stuff so that we can have some that configuration solid going forward. We do need to avoid what's called scope creep, and that is minor changes and adjustment to fit better defined users. A little innocuous requests like, hey, we can just add this while you're in there. Oh, it would be great if they had this. Developers are often very, very likely to want to do those things because they're easy. They want to please the user. Problem is that all takes time away from other requirements that need to get done, and we tend to sort of absorb a lot of these scope changes without wanting to upset the customer. We want them to be happy with us going forward, but we need to avoid that. So verbal change orders are problems generally. They need to be translated into constructive change orders that we can document, track, and control through the WBS. At the end of the day, your customer is going to be pleased if it meets the acceptance criteria, not if it has all the little things that they wanted along the way. So changes to defined scope can be errors of omission need to be addressed. Maybe we missed something. They can be a risk response. So we have a risk coming up and we need to respond to that through the scope. There can be something we did discover that would be really value added and it's worth adding some more into it. So we just there are reasons to change the scope. We just need to track all those and make sure we're following change control processes. So that's it for this week, or for the scope part of this week. We'll be talking about scheduling cost as well. But why don't you get to that intro and go ahead and read the parts in the chapter related to this.